Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, can Burnham's belated COBRA meeting find any substantive solutions to England's desperate drought? We talk to the author of a report on the economic costs of this sweltering summer. And the Democratic Socialists in America suffer their first big setback in a while. I'm Aaron Bastani, and tonight I should be joined by Michael Walker. This should have been a live show, but because of technical issues, that wasn't to be. If you want to help future-proof Novara media and make sure that these kinds of technical issues don't become more pervasive, that as we get bigger and better, they all but disappear, you can, of course, go to novaramedia.com/support, help us build a new media for different politics. We're trying to mix it up with the big boys. We don't always succeed. We're trying our best with a little help from our friends, namely you. The link for that is in the description below. Help us build a new media for different politics. On a separate, but somewhat related point, you can listen to this show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And of course, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments below. Last Wednesday, Zach Polanski called an impromptu press conference to demand Andy Burnham chair an emergency COBRA meeting on the droughts. This afternoon, it happened. Zach Polanski welcomed that news. Good. Now we need action. Tax fossil fuel giants to pay for firefighting helicopters, a cool space in every community, a maximum working temperature, and no new oil and gas extraction in the North Sea. We cannot negotiate with the science. COBRA meetings are called to deal with national emergencies, and they bring together the Prime Minister, senior civil servants, and ministers and officials from relevant departments, all the people who should be on top of the details. We're yet to get confirmation as to what was discussed or decided, but reports this morning suggested Burnham's plans are unlikely to meet the ambition demanded by the Greens. Burnham told journalists this morning that one thing he would be considering is a ban on disposable barbecues. To be clear, this isn't a bad idea. This is from The Guardian. In July this year, firefighters called to Cannock Chase found an area the size of a football field blazing in the summer heat. The heathland in Sherbrooke Valley, part of a special area of conservation, was home to adders, toads and other wildlife, which were thought to have suffered severe damage, though no people were harmed. The cause of the fire was identified as a disposable barbecue. Disposable barbecues, which can be carried into public areas, present a number of problems. They remain hot, sometimes for hours, after they're used, making them extremely difficult to dispose of safely. And when they cannot be carried away, people are forced to leave them or place them into bins where they carry on smouldering. Burying the barbecues, as some try to do, will not stop the danger, as these trays of charcoal can reach 450 degrees C and will carry on burning underground, where they can still ignite fires long after use. On beaches, the buried coals and metal grills are also a hazard for walkers, and in fields for farm animals. On a personal note, I think this is a really sensible first step. Is a ban on disposable barbecues going to help solve the climate crisis, solve the drought? Is it going to help us have more sustainable infrastructure and food production? Of course it's not, but it's very easy. You know, sometimes it's okay to start with the really easy stuff. And the fact that in British politics, we don't address the easy stuff time after time after time, I think speaks for itself. You know, on the high street, the classic example for me, I keep on talking about this, is the bins where you put clothes for charities, right? And of course they get full up and then people just fly tip everything. Everything. Not just clothes, but rubbish, mattresses, chairs. So these basically become signs, signals even, to say, fly tip here. Or telephone boxes with no phones in them. They've not been in there for 20 years. What happens in them? People like to urinate in them. People often sell drugs from them. These are very easy things to eliminate. Are they going to remake Britain? Not really. Most people don't even notice this stuff. It's just weirdos like me. But it costs next to nothing. And when you think of, for instance, the charity shop bins, who's actually having to clean that stuff up? It's local authorities, it's the councils. So the council taxpayer is subsidising charities to have these awful bins, which, by the way, I've spoken to people in that sector, they barely use any of the clothes. It's more about having their brand on a high street, basically advertising their good work and obviously to get more money, which they're entitled to do, but it's not good policy. So I think this is a sensible move. I don't think it's sufficient. I don't think anybody thinks it's sufficient, but it's a sensible move. And you know what? You can get a really good mobile barbecue that you can use again and again and again on Amazon. I don't like using Amazon, but you can get it on Amazon for 30 quid. If you want to spend a bit more money, I think it's a Smoky Joe with Weber. It's about 80 quid. And you can take that where you like. And it's a great barbecue. By the way, these disposable barbecues barely cook food. It's awful. My dad, who's Iranian, he's Turkish-Iranian, will say, don't trust an Englishman with a barbecue, which is ridiculous, of course. One of my best friends, one of my good friends, is fabulous with barbecues. He's an Englishman. But his line of thinking with this is, who else uses disposable barbecues? These people aren't serious about cooking their meat outdoors, which, there's something to that, right? So from a climate perspective in terms of fires, no good. Obviously, from a sustainability perspective, these are one-off use. They should be banned anyway, let's be honest. So this is good. This is Andy Burnham, what he's very able at doing. Big issue. He'll zone in on a tiny detail, which people understand, and he'll get lots of consensus behind it, and he'll do something about it. Good for him. It's a start. The Greens could, I hope, push beyond it, though. It would make sense to invest a lot in climate adaptation over the next few months because next year is set to be even warmer than 2026. Zeki Housefather is a climate scientist at Berkeley. He's plotted this chart projecting 2027, and it will be considerably hotter than this year. He's captioned it, quote, I'm not sure, folks, have realized just how crazy the second half of 2026 and 2027 will be for global temperatures on the back of a record-smashing El Nino event. Here is my latest estimate of where both years will end up compared to global temperatures since 1850. That's worrying. Unfortunately for us, global average temperature rises have been hitting Europe harder than anywhere else. Europe is now 2.5 degrees Celsius hotter than before the mass burning of fossil fuels, almost double the global average of 1.4 degrees. So it's 1.4 degrees basically since the mid-19th century. In Europe, it's more. So when people talk about 1.5 or 2, or as it presently is 1.4, that is, of course, a global average. In some places, it's cooler. Some places, it's warmer. We don't talk about it enough. The sea is very good at absorbing the heat. So over sea, 70% of the Earth's surface area, it's cooler. Over land mass, it's warmer. Temperatures in Europe, for instance, have risen by 0.56 degrees a decade since the mid-1990s. That compares with 0.42 in North America, 0.36 in Africa, and 0.27 degrees centigrade in South America. On the one hand, maybe that's a good thing. We kicked off the Industrial Revolution and we're relatively rich. It's better. We have faster warming in Europe than, say, sub-Saharan Africa, where it will be much harder to adapt. But the reason Europe is warming up faster than elsewhere also brings many causes for concern. This heat map from the Copernicus Institute shows how much different parts of the world are heating up. Obviously, you can only see half the world here, but it's enough to show you that the fastest warming region on Earth is the Arctic, which is heating up at around 1.5 degrees Celsius a decade. Eastern Europe is also badly affected, and you can also see the worrying cold blob, which could indicate the AMOC might be slowing down. That's to do with the jet stream over the North Atlantic. It's a system of ocean currents which brings warmer water up to the North Atlantic from the tropics. The Arctic being hotter than anywhere else is not good, as it can bring about tipping points with less ice. Less sunlight is, of course, reflected back onto the atmosphere. And the melting of permafrost is also a big concern. I mean, let's keep this image up for a minute. You can see that Siberia and, of course, the Arctic, as I just said, get really hot. You can't see it here, but, of course, it's the same story in the north part of the Western Hemisphere. Famously, I think in 2022, British Columbia, Vancouver, folks, saw 49 degrees centigrade. I think that was one of the data points where I said to myself, what on earth is happening? But it being the hottest over the Arctic is so important for a bunch of reasons. For instance, if the Greenland ice sheet disappears, you can see Greenland right at the top there. That's not doing as badly as the bit of the Arctic over northern Russia. But if the Greenland ice sheet disappears, I think sea levels rise by a good 4 or 5 meters, pretty sharpish. When I say sharpish, not in 10 years, but, pretty sharpish. It happens pretty quickly. And that is, I think, the deal breaker, really, between whether or not we get the jet stream sticking around or not. So basically, if the Greenland ice sheet melts, Britain, it's plausible. It gets a lot warmer for 50, 60 years, and then it gets much, much colder. Because, of course, people don't realize this, but somewhere like Rome is on the same latitude as New York. The reason why Europe is so much warmer than North America is because of the jet stream. So it's not just about temperatures here, it's also about the jet stream. It's also, of course, about sea levels. If all of that ice melts, then sea levels will be significantly higher than they are today. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but this story over the last couple of weeks just brings the climate systems breakdown story to, so close to home. I mean, I live in Hampshire. I live on the south coast. I'm from Dorset. I now live in Hampshire. Right between those two places, of course, the New Forest. And seeing New Forest ponies running through ash, smoke literally coming up from the floor. Hearing about birds that will, nest on the ground, they'll reproduce on the ground, like nightjars, for instance. Many of those will have obviously been killed in the last few days. This is really, really bad, and it's just starting. It is just starting. And I think some people on the left, often we get accused of being alarmists. And sometimes I think that's true. Sometimes the left goes a bit overboard, right? I don't agree with people when they say, I don't want to have kids because of climate change. What kind of a world are we bringing children into? Well, people brought children into a world much worse than this one 5,000 years ago. If they didn't, you wouldn't be here. So I think sometimes the alarmism can go over the top, or at least be irrational, not internally coherent. But this is really, really bad. This is really, really bad. We have, I think now, in terms of parts per million with CO2, we have about 430 parts per million in the air. I think it was about 270 in the 1850s. And if we carry on like this, I think by the 2070s, we get to the mid-500s. I read somewhere, I think it was Bill Maguire, if we burn all of the fossil fuels available to us, coal, gas, oil, maybe peat as well, I guess, and obviously that's not going to happen. If we burn all of the fossil fuels available to us as a species, I think planetary warming would be something like 15 degrees warmer than today. Obviously, we're wiped out. We're probably wiped out at 5 or 6, right? And that's not me saying this as a climatologist, because I'm not. It's somebody who just reads these people. Bill Maguire is a volcanologist at UCL. So if we burn all of these resources, the planet's probably 15, 16 degrees warmer than, I think, either today or the mid-19th century. And I presume that people who have no issue with climate change, people, who vote reform or whoever they vote for, but of course these people have a higher propensity to vote for certain parties or vote for the Tories or whatever. If they think this is no issue at all and we just keep on burning fossil fuels, what, you just accept that actually 15 degrees warming isn't a problem? Nobody thinks that, right? They'll say, well, no, we should reduce CO2 emissions. That's what, and then you go, okay, we've found a middle ground here, haven't we? So we should reduce them. How quickly? Well, not as quickly as you're saying. Okay, well, you're reacting to a political position I have. What's your solution? And that's where we've got to get to. I do, however, think, and I'll finish with this summer has woken up so many climate skeptics in Britain. So many. I think even if they thought it was real, the scenes that we're seeing across England, where more than 2/3 of this nation is in drought, I think they thought that was 30, 40, 50 years away. No, it's coming. And as Kevin Anderson said to me on Downstream last week, in terms of, the averages, this is as good as it gets now for the rest of your life. It's only going to get worse because of CO2 and methane and water vapor that's already been ejected into the atmosphere. The point is now, what can we mitigate going forward? Reform and the Tories like to complain that the transition to net zero is too expensive. But in case you hadn't noticed, climate change turns out to be pretty expensive too. It takes a lot of money to put out forest fires, and even more if they burn down houses. Installing air conditioning for the summers and flood defences for the autumn and winter also doesn't come cheap. And one think tank has attempted to put a figure on the cost of the UK's summer of extraordinary heat waves and droughts. The think tank is called Verdant, and they have projected that the heat this summer may have cost over £4 billion in lost output. And that figure is based on the assumption that very hot weather lowers labour productivity, which of course seems plausible, I'd imagine, to most people. For a more detailed sense of where this estimate came from, my colleague Michael Walker spoke to the report's author earlier on today. That is, of course, friend of the show, James Meadway.
So the £4.4 billion is an estimate for the loss in output, how much the economy produces over the 3 summer heat waves. And you get there by saying, okay, what's the temperature that was reached in all the different local authorities across the entire country? This is Met Office data to get you that. And then what we did was look at some research from Alliance, the insurers, which said that basically every degree over 30 degrees you have in an area, it's about 3% off the amount you can produce in any working hour in that area. So you take those two things, put them together, and that gives you the estimate for the total loss from the heat waves over this summer. It's based, as I say, originally on research by Alliance, who are one of the world's biggest insurance companies. Met Office data to get you the temperatures, then our calculations to get you the final figure.
And as far as I understand it, and also just, I think everyone knows this anecdotally, hot temperatures make you less productive. They make you sort of slower at thinking in general. Obviously, though, presumably one thing that really matters is whether your workplace has air conditioning. Does that make a big difference here?
It does make a difference. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's sort of two different channels for effects. One of them is especially if you're doing outdoor work, if you're working on a construction site or you're picking fruit, the effect is very immediate and physical. The second one is more subtle. It's if you're in an office that gets hot, it's just harder to think, as you say. It's not just anecdotally. We actually have good sort of scientific evidence around this. The particular bit that starts to matter, especially in London over June, London and other built-up areas, is that you have these tropical nights over 20 degrees, when, okay, you're in an air-conditioned office, but then you come home and it's baking hot, you can't sleep, you don't sleep properly, you go in the next day, it's air conditioned, but you have not had good sleep, you can't work as well. And that's a kind of cumulative impact that builds up over time during these heat waves that you see even in office environments.
And will we see this in the GDP statistics? Obviously, you've made this prediction based on these assumptions. Will it be the case that sort of at the end of August, we'll be able to see if actually the economy did sort of lose that much amount of, or that value of production?
Well, it'll be mixed in with everything else that GDP records, but it should be a bit lower than you might anticipate. That's basically what this estimate is telling us. That it would have been 4.4 billion bigger, and now it's going to be a little bit smaller than that. So with everything else going on, it will sort of maybe get mixed in with the impacts of the Iran war and all sorts of other things. But nonetheless, that's real and it's happening. And we think, obviously, this effect is going to get worse in Britain, across Europe, over the coming years, as unfortunately climate change worsens.
So you're very open about it in the report that you're just looking at labour productivity. There are obviously other costs of heat waves. We're seeing images of forest fires. It presumably takes a lot of money to put those out, and then they cause some damage as well that presumably lasts a while. I know farmers are struggling with yields because it's so dry. So could we imagine the cost actually being even higher than what you've suggested?
Yes, you'd have thought so. Wildfires is an obvious one where it's just expensive to have to put these things out. That's a cost that most likely falls on government. I mean, by the way, one consequence of what we're saying is that the government deficit will be slightly bigger because you get less in taxes than you might have expected. There's the potential costs of, you turn the air conditioning on or the fan or whatever, your electricity bill goes up. So that's a cost to businesses and to households. So all of these things start to stack up on top of what we're seeing. And then, of course, there's the longer term impact. So particularly severe wildfire might knock things out for a long period of time. Final bit is, of course, farming, which the reports are already pretty alarming about how badly impacted harvests have been over this year. We'll probably start to see that coming through in the autumn in significant increases in the price of food, both from Britain and, of course, everything we have to buy from the rest of the world.
And it's 20 years now since the Stern report was written. That was written in 2006 by sort of a very distinguished economist, asked for by the Labour government at the time. And his big argument, which was seen as quite groundbreaking at the time, was to say that, yes, it's expensive to deal with climate change, but if we fail to mitigate climate change, the costs of its consequences will be much higher, considerably higher. Your argument that you're making today is, along a similar line. And I wonder if you can sort of look back over those 2 decades. Do you think that message has sort of sunk in to global leaders?
I mean, in practice, yes, there's been a fair amount of progress being made in decarbonising energy systems in particular. This country, the UK, has a significantly decarbonised energy system compared to what it had in 2006. There's no coal production of any sort taking place now in terms of our energy mix. So that's something that's actually happened. If you look at the progress that China's been making and the exports of all this renewable technology, now incredibly cheap, solar panels, battery technology to the rest of the world. So there's progress that's been made relative to the sort of scenarios that Stern was talking about back then. The problem is it's just not enough. So we've made this progress, but you're still getting hit by climate change. We're still getting hit by the impacts of all that carbon dioxide in particular that's been burnt over, 2 centuries of industrialization. So we've made progress. It's just not enough. And that's why we're seeing these sort of real economic costs in addition to everything else that you're getting with these heat waves.
And these kind of projections that you're doing, are they also being done in the Treasury? Obviously, we hear all the time about Treasury brain. They can't look at the long term, and they're always saying, oh, we shouldn't spend this, we shouldn't spend that. And they're not looking at how investments now could save us money in the future. Are there people in the Treasury doing these kind of sums, or is this something which is alien to them?
Well, it's the Office of Budget Responsibility that's taken a bit of a lead in doing this, and they have given projections for what will happen to the British economy if climate change just continues unchecked into the future. And it's all pretty alarming. This is very, very significant increases in government debt, which is, of course, the thing they really fixate on. Huge increases in the deficit, big impact on growth. It's all there. I would say that from our point of view, a lot of this stuff is sitting there in those OBR reports as quite distant things that happen by 2050, 2070, when we need to think about some of the really sort of not unexpected, but jarring impacts that we get already, like heat waves. So the average temperature increases a bit, but then you have these big spikes in temperature during the summer months. And this is where the real costs are starting to appear. It's when not just the averages increase, the sort of day-to-day typical things increase. You also have these big dramatic events like the heat waves we've had over this summer. That's where some of the real sort of immediate costs start to appear. But there is clearly some thinking like this taking place in government, for sure.
That was my colleague Michael Walker speaking to the co-founder of the Verdant think tank earlier today, James Meadway. Before we move on to our next story, I have personal experience of this. Right now, we're having a loft conversion, not because we're posh, but because we can't afford to move. We're in a terraced house and we're having a second child. Ideally, they'd have a bedroom, right? So we're converting the loft, and we know the guys involved in it, partly through family. So we have a decent rapport, and the windows haven't turned up. The windows have been weeks, and the staircase didn't turn up for weeks. Both were delayed. And it turns out that both the factories of the windows and the staircase are in the UK, and they shut down because of extreme heat right at the start of the summer. I don't know if you remember, we started to do shows remotely, right? Because it was getting to 35, 36. Those factories also shut down, I think, for a week, which makes sense, doesn't it? Presumably they don't have air conditioning. Presumably they can't really do much beyond 30, 31. Even then it's a stretch, but you get all the fans blazing, you can just about do it. But at 35, 36, you've got heavy machinery, it gets hot. It's obviously much hotter inside than it is outside. It's just not manageable, is it? So just me, anecdotally, I know of 2 businesses who had to do shutdowns because of the heat. And there are so many stories like this, which we're not talking about. I saw an amazing one in Japan. Japanese work culture is being revolutionized by the oil crisis, of course, ongoing with Iran, but also with the heat as well. So Japan this time of year, tons of air conditioning, and it means that the Japanese salaryman can wear his suit to work. And they've broken with protocol. This year, they're going into work with T-shirts and shorts. And that has stunned and stupefied, the sartorial conservatives in Japanese discourse. They are very upset. And that is a direct outgrowth of geopolitics and climate change. So this is happening. If you want to deny it, go ahead. But these are very real manifestations of the stuff that we talk about all the time. Geopolitics, but in this instance, more so climate change. It's happening, and the repercussions are absolutely everywhere, not least the UK economy. Last Tuesday was a big moment for the American left. That was with Abdul El-Sayed, of course, winning the Michigan Senate primary for the Democrats, proving the left can win nominations in purple states, and they can take on and defeat the money of the Israel lobby. And polls had suggested the Democratic Socialists of America would do another win this week in Wisconsin. Their member, Francesca Hong, had been the frontrunner in a primary for the governorship of the state. Polls had shown her 20 points ahead of her nearest rival. But by Wednesday morning, it was clear she'd lost, even if by the narrowest of margins. With almost all votes counted, the establishment-backed Democrat David Crowley has 39.78% of the vote. Hong has 39.37% of the vote. Hong, who is a chef and restaurant owner, was dogged by negative stories about past tweets calling for the abolition of the police and even cancelling Thanksgiving, which she, of course, struggled to rebut or even explain. This was one viral clip during the campaign.
You talked about your past positions that he keeps highlighting and, obviously likely would continue to do so before November should you win. One thing that they brought up as well was a post from you in 2021 where you said Americans should cancel Thanksgiving, should have done this in 1621. The post has been deleted. Republicans have been highlighting it. Do you still believe that Thanksgiving should be canceled?
I'm a chef, and one of the first meals that I made that was for the community when I was 16 was a Thanksgiving meal. You know, I always think my hospitality background in owning a restaurant for 7-8 years, that bringing folks around the table to share conversation and build community is always a good thing. But Thanksgiving is also a time that's incredibly painful for many people in our communities. And so I think I wanted to make sure that people understood that there are multiple views, but views can evolve. And the position that I'm running for right now, and I think my background as a chef, will actually help me become a better governor that's able to bring more people to the table.
I don't think anything she said there was actually unreasonable. I don't agree with all of it, but it's not unreasonable. These are coherent points. But it's not great populist politics, which is perhaps why Bernie Sanders and AOC withheld any endorsement of Hong, which is a shame. It's a shame. You said one thing in the winter of 2020. We were kind of all going a bit crazy, and you don't win, which is a shame. She probably would have been a very good public representative. But the closeness of the race means there has been some backlash at the decision of those two, namely Bernie Sanders and AOC, to stay out of the race. Nathan Robinson is editor of the leftist Current Affairs magazine. He said this: "Totally inexcusable that Bernie and AOC failed to back Hong. If she loses narrowly, it will be a major setback for the socialist movement that they will bear major responsibility for." Someone with a different take on why Hong lost was Julian Andreoni from Droughts News. "Americans love economic populism. They want another New Deal, but they are completely turned off by college campus, culture warrior, performative activism. Evidence? These results happened in almost neighboring states on the same night." Andreoni is comparing Hong's loss in the Wisconsin primary to a win in the Minnesota Senate primary by Peggy Flanagan. Flanagan ran on progressive priorities, including universal health care, a high minimum wage, and an end to unconditional US aid for Israel. These were all very popular things, particularly with undecided voters. She was also massively outspent by a corporate-backed rival. Flanagan was backed by Bernie Sanders, but she does not identify as a socialist and was not backed by the DSA. Here's how she accepted the Democratic nomination.
"As your next senator, here are the things that I'm ready to throw down for. Ending the despicable priorities of an administration that hands out tax breaks to billionaires, builds gilded ballrooms, and spends billions on bombs while screwing over working people. Truly affordable housing so that people can pay their rent and young people can buy their first home before they're middle-aged. Passing right to repair so that Minnesota farmers can fix their own damn equipment. And getting rid of prior authorization so that some dude behind a desk, or worse yet, an AI bot, isn't determining whether you get the life-saving health care that your doctor has prescribed. And passing Medicare for all because we are going to make healthcare available and affordable once and for all.
She doesn't identify as a socialist. That's winning, by the way. When people talk about policies far to the left of the Democrats, then at any point before 2016, not including the New Deal, obviously, and they say, look, I'm not a socialist. I just want to put working people first. I want to stop tax cuts for billionaires. I want to stop support for Israel. I want to build homes for working people. But I'm not a socialist. Fine. Knock yourself out. That's winning. When people do everything you want in your agenda, that sounds like Bernie Sanders. but I'm not a socialist. That's fine. And by the way, before people in the comments say, what does social democracy? I know. But clearly the tenor, the tone, the rhetoric, that is fire and brimstone left-wing politics. If she doesn't want to identify as that, great. Fine by me. To get a lowdown on Tuesday's primaries and what they meant for the American left, earlier on today, my colleague Michael Walker spoke to Branko Marcetic. He's, of course, a staff writer at the magazine Jacobin.
I think there was one major race that was a very bitter, disappointing loss, which is the gubernatorial race in Wisconsin. I mean, that really was, the biggest prize for socialists because it was a statewide race in the Midwest. Socialists wanted to prove that they could win in the Midwestern state on the state level. And it would have been an electoral test for the socialist movement in the general election. So that was really the biggest prize, and that's a massive disappointment. Is it an overall defeat? I think it's hard to make that case if you look at the candidates that DSA chapters, Democratic Socialists of America chapters actually endorsed. Most of them did end up moving on to the general election and winning their races. Now, those I don't think eclipse the Fran Hong defeat, but it is important, I think, to keep it into perspective that on the whole, socialist candidates did end up winning last night.
Also, just to clarify, because I know I've very much familiar with Hong and Flanagan. What are the DSA-backed or sort of DSA candidates who did win last night? What kind of races are we talking about there?
There were several incumbents that won re-election. Ryan Clancy, for instance, in Wisconsin. He's in the state assembly. There was also Omar Fateh, which, he had run for mayor of Minneapolis. He won his state Senate re-election bid. But there were also others that won. I mean, in Minnesota, for instance, the school board race, Twin Cities DSA endorsed candidate won for that position. You had a socialist candidate actually running, two socialist candidates running to replace Fran Hong in her current seat. One was a DSA-backed socialist candidate, Juliana Bennett. She lost to another socialist candidate. And I also have confirmed from Ryan Clancy, who I just mentioned before, that the Wisconsin Legislative Socialist Caucus, which did not exist 4 years ago, and the last time it existed was about 100 years ago, is going to expand in the next legislative session, partly because of, some of the wins that I mentioned, but also partly because I think some members are going to join that caucus who were not identifying as socialists before. And then sort of a few other kind of smaller races down ballot that were won by socialist candidates. Also, I'll be remiss to not mention in Connecticut and Vermont, which also had primaries, there were several socialist candidates that won, including one for the Connecticut State Senate, I believe, the first Muslim candidate that will sit in that body. So there are some other major wins, if we look beyond that one kind of very disappointing defeat.
So you got some local victories alongside the sort of nationwide defeat, or I suppose this is a statewide defeat, but it would be to go to a nationwide body. What happened with Hong then? I mean, there's been some fallout today. I've sort of seen it on X. People arguing whether or not Bernie and AOC have let down the socialist cause by not backing Francesca Hong. Obviously people on the other side saying that they made the right decision because she was a weak candidate. This is what they're saying. She was a weak candidate and she probably would have lost in the generals, and that would have been more damaging for socialists than her losing the primary. Where do you stand on that?
I think it's a fair criticism. Hong lost by a few thousand votes. I think it was 0.4%. If Sanders and AOC, and not just those two, the entire kind of slate of recent socialist candidates who went to campaign for Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan just last week, they stayed away from the race. And I think that reflects some of the internal doubts within the left about, Hong as a candidate. I think a lot of people were kind of wanting to see if she would be able to get through this primary before they kind of stepped in and wanted to lend their names to her campaign. But at the same time, such hesitancy can also become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it could be that by staying away from the race, they may have ended up kind of securing a defeat for her. I think also, before we get too hung up on these endorsements, we don't know if these endorsements would have made a difference. There's also other factors that played a role in this. I mean, one was, again, Hong, the socialist candidate, was way outspent by the kind of Democratic Party establishment. Her campaign was really running on fumes. It wasn't very well funded. I think they spent something like $500,000 or less than $500,000 on ads, whereas Crowley, the candidate who ended up winning, the forces behind him spent about $4 million. So it wasn't as dramatic a overspending ratio compared to the Michigan race, so that one really was an outlier in terms of just how much money was being poured. But they were significantly outspent. There were also, internal mistakes that the Hong campaign made, arguably mistakes. I mean, for instance, Hong was the only candidate who did not spend a single cent on TV advertising. And she, I think that was the strategy, was we're going to try and focus on the voters that we need to turn out, that we know are going to be enthused about our campaign. But it could be argued that, in that final stretch, as the establishment was kind of really attacking her, and as they spent big on these ads that were kind of calling into question her electability, putting some money towards television advertising herself to kind of reach some of these voters and allay their fears may have helped to combat this. And I think other people have pointed out that Hong didn't really go on the attack, whereas in the final stretch, they really were hammering her for some of these electability concerns. And, there have been questions raised about, could Hong have been a little more nimble and skilled in kind of dealing with some of these questions that were being raised about these old tweets and so on and so forth. With every campaign, there are a million things I think that you can point to. But I think, in terms of what the campaign itself could have controlled, those are things that should be looked at, and reflected on in the months ahead, besides just the kind of Sanders and AOC and so on, not jumping in.
And another analysis I've seen online today from a bunch of people is to say Peggy Flanagan, who has become the Senate candidate in Minnesota. She's a sort of economic populist. She wants Medicare for all. She wants to rein in the power of the billionaires. But she hasn't got the same sort of history of saying abolish the police or cancel Halloween. And that shows actually the way to victory, which is economic populism without the kind of cultural stuff that many people find alienating or weird. And I suppose this feeds in really, doesn't it, to AOC saying woke one was crazy. So how does this result feed into that particular debate about whether or not economic populists should ditch the cultural stuff?
I mean, I think that the defund slogan, for instance, that one has been problematic. Obviously it made sense at the time, but there has been an effort by socialist candidates since then to kind of reframe how they talk about this issue. Actually polling and even elections show that the public is in favor of diverting funding towards sort of more less punitive kind of alternatives to policing, basically. People who are first responders, who aren't police, who aren't armed, mental health professionals, and so on and so forth. We have seen that actually be an electoral winner in certain parts of the country. I think the fact that you see people like Hong and Al Sayed kind of, and Zara Mamdani too, kind of backing away from some of these issues, I think reflects acknowledgement that this is not necessarily the most electorally viable thing. And when it comes to some of the more cultural stuff, some of the things that Hong really became controversial for, hating on holidays, public holidays, and talking about race in these very kind of specific kind of campus-oriented ways. I think that stuff has really been widely acknowledged as pretty toxic and alienating. I think that's an outgrowth of where the left was in this long period of wilderness in the first part of the 21st century. And I think there's an understanding that to really be able to meet people where they are, that kind of stuff has to be left behind. I think with Flanagan, we should also mention, Flanagan was kind of a more establishment candidate, even though she did have these policy positions that overlap with the left. She was the lieutenant governor. So she was someone who was more of a well-known quantity in the state, and was able to kind of balance those progressive positions while kind of having the auspices of being a sort of more establishment back candidate.
Super interesting conversation between Michael and Branko. He does great work. Jacobin does great work. There is so much interesting media right now in the States. We've just cited, of course, Droughts news a little bit earlier in the story. There's Jacobin 2, other publications as well. Just coming from the left and helping to redefine the terms of what's just a credible political conversation, which is really distilled with someone like Peggy Flanagan, right? They have the agenda of the radical left in the US, of the DSA, without being in the DSA. Great. And I do think there's a learning there in terms of these two different politicians, Peggy Flanagan and Hong, and why one did well and one underwhelmed, right? I think it's pretty instructive. I agree it's actually quite straightforward as to why that happened. At the same time, I think Hong is 37 now, so they were 31 when they were saying that stuff. I'm 42, so that's a baby, of course. But, people can say slightly strange or incoherent things during a COVID lockdown. I don't think that should disqualify them from ever standing for public office. But you know what? She's young. She can stand again. But that stuff just isn't very popular. As my colleague Michael Walker has said many, many times, it's just not popular with the median voter. And that's fine. You're allowed to think it. You might even be right. Michael Walker might be wrong. But if you want to win public office, you can't really say that. Does that mean that, more people in prison is a good idea? I think Britain, for instance, has too many people in prison. I think America certainly has too many people in prison. What are the solutions? Of course, the point, right? That's what you're then meant to discuss. But these kind of huge statements that are just sort of put out on social media, again, fine if you want to do it. But if you also want to win public office, it's probably going to hold you back, as this person found out this week. I would say thank you to Michael Walker. He wasn't here tonight. He had to leave. This wasn't a live show. Of course, it should have been. It could have been. If you want to future-proof Novara Media and stop that server from just dropping off the face of the earth again, you know what to do. Go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. We can't just have a single point of failure when it comes to our servers and our infrastructure. So whether it's £1 a month, £2 a month, £5 a month, whatever it is, help us keep on building this project. 1.3 million subscribers here on YouTube. We're going to hit 1 million on Instagram very, very soon. I think in the next week. So we're taking these conversations, certainly in the UK, to a very, very big audience. £1 a month. Help us do that little bit more. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another stream from 6 p.m. It will not be live stream from the studio. It's remote because it's going to be very, very hot. And the heat affects not just how we think and feel. It doesn't just mean drought and fire. It also means it's very hard to produce a show when it's 35 degrees C. So people will be broadcasting from the comfort of their homes. It won't be a regular thing, we hope. Maybe this is the end of a very hot summer. Touch wood. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.